On a gray Seattle morning in early 2004, a quiet storm was brewing behind the gates of one of the most secure residences in America. Bill Gates' ultramodern, technology-laden mansion overlooking Lake Washington. Hidden behind walls of glass, concrete, and mystery, the house, famously known as Xanadu 2.0, was a marvel of architectural genius. But what few knew then, and only a few know now, is that the greatest threat to the Gates empire didn't come from a cyber attack, a competitor, or a scandal in Silicon Valley. It came from within, and her name was Maria Estrada. Maria had been working at the Gates residence for nearly 9 years. She was reliable, discreet, and loyal, or so everyone thought. Originally from Oaxaca, Mexico, Maria had immigrated to the United States in the late 1980s and eventually found her way into domestic work for high-profile families. She was fluent in both English and Spanish, but rarely spoke unless spoken to. She blended into the background effortlessly, like a shadow in the vast, high-ceilinged corridors of Xanadu 2.0. Her job required absolute trust. She had security clearance. She knew the layout of the house like the back of her hand and had access to rooms even Microsoft executives weren't allowed to enter. She knew where everything was stored, from family heirlooms and personal notes to prototype devices never seen by the public. And for years, she never overstepped her boundaries. That changed when she discovered the room. It started innocently enough. Bill had flown to Geneva for a climate conference, and Melinda was in New York visiting the kids. The house was nearly empty, save for a skeleton crew of staff. Maria was tasked with overseeing cleaning rotations in seldom-used quarters. While dusting behind a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf in the East Wing, her hand slipped behind a heavy volume of Da Vinci's codices and clicked a hidden lever. The shelf creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow passageway lit by subtle LED strips. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside, curiosity overwhelming her better judgment. At the end of the hall was a door secured by a biometric scanner, but to her astonishment, it unlocked automatically. The last person to access the room had apparently forgotten to lock it again. Inside was what could only be described as a private archive. Rows of climate-controlled cases, walls lined with encrypted hard drives, journals, printed emails, and hundreds of old videotapes labeled in black marker. Most bore innocuous titles like IBM Negotiations 91 or Macworld Keynote Drafts. But one caught her eye. Confession, December 1998. She knew she shouldn't have, but she did. She slid the tape into the deck and pressed play. What she saw altered her perception of Bill Gates forever. The grainy footage showed a younger Bill seated alone in his home office, visibly distressed. For nearly 47 minutes, he spoke into the camera about a failed philanthropic project in Africa. He described unintended consequences, misallocated funds, and a cover-up designed to protect the Gates Foundation's reputation. There was no malice in his tone, only deep regret. Yet it was explosive. If made public, it could have upended public trust and triggered global scrutiny. Maria paused the tape halfway through, hands trembling. She knew immediately what this was: leverage. But leverage for what? She wasn't an extortionist. She wasn't greedy. She didn't want money. She wanted something else, something that had haunted her for years. Her brother, Javier. In 1999, Javier Estrada was arrested in Mexico on charges of cyber theft. A brilliant self-taught coder, he'd hacked into several government databases to expose corruption. He was portrayed as a criminal by the authorities, but to Maria, he was a whistleblower. He'd been imprisoned without trial, and every attempt she made to get him legal aid had been stonewalled. She saw her opportunity. Instead of stealing the tape outright, Maria copied it. She had a hidden minicam in her uniform, an old habit from a previous job in a paranoid Beverly Hills household. She recorded the screen silently, knowing she had what she needed. Over the next 3 weeks, she contacted former activists, journalists, and lawyers under pseudonyms. She sent snippets of the video anonymously, testing waters. The reactions were immediate. Offers poured in for interviews, exclusive rights, and even blackmail proposals. She ignored them all. Finally, she arranged an anonymous meeting with one man she believed could help. Luis Abarca, a former human rights lawyer turned NGO director. She met him in a crowded cafe in Tacoma, dressed as a cleaning lady from a different agency. There, she revealed only her voice, her story, and a heavily edited version of the tape. Luis agreed to help. With his international connections, they launched a legal campaign to draw attention to Javier's case. Within months, foreign journalists began poking around old Mexican court records. Amnesty International quietly added Javier to their list of political prisoners. The case gained traction. Back in Seattle, Maria kept working as if nothing had changed. She cleaned, cooked, and folded towels, all while orchestrating a silent campaign for her brother's freedom. But secrets don't stay buried in billionaires' houses. In July 2005, a digital forensics specialist at Microsoft noticed an anomaly in the backup logs from the house's security systems. A brief window of tampering, a missing security tape. An internal review followed. Maria was questioned, not by police, but by private investigators in corporate suits. She denied everything. They had no proof. Weeks later, she resigned. Quietly. No fanfare. She left with a severance package and a glowing recommendation letter, as if nothing had ever happened. But Javier was freed the following year. Officially, it was due to a procedural error. Unofficially, it was due to the pressure that Maria had orchestrated behind closed doors. She never spoke publicly about what she did. She never sold the tape. And to this day, no one, not even Luis, knows her real name. Maria Estrada vanished into the fabric of society once more, possibly working for another wealthy family, possibly living under a different name in a different country. But deep within the concrete and glass walls of Bill Gates' mansion, there remains an empty space on a shelf in the East Wing. The lever was sealed, the room resecured, and tighter protocols put in place. Yet the story of what Maria stole isn't just about a videotape or a secret. It's about justice. It's about what one seemingly invisible woman did with access, courage, and conviction, and how the greatest heist inside the house of a billionaire was never about wealth at all. It was about redemption. Years later, in a quiet library in Lisbon, Portugal, a woman with salt and pepper hair and horn-rimmed glasses attended a seminar on digital ethics. The audience was small. The speaker was a young professor who referenced, in vague terms, the anonymous whistleblowing that changed how NGOs operated in Latin America. The woman listened carefully, taking notes, never revealing her connection. After the lecture, she approached the professor. In soft Spanish, she thanked him for the insight. "It's good to know the world noticed," she said. He smiled and asked her name. "Just Maria," she replied, before disappearing into the rainy evening, umbrella in hand, vanishing once again into the quiet fabric of history. And the secret she once held? Still out there, unleaked, uncached, untouched. Because some people don't steal to gain. Some people steal to set things right. But the story didn't end there. In early 2010, a cybersecurity analyst named Roland Kimball, then working for a private firm contracted to audit old Microsoft data archives, uncovered a fragment of a file backed up to a long decommissioned server. Encrypted, partial, and heavily corrupted, it bore metadata referencing confession, December 1998. Kimball flagged it, but protocol demanded he elevate it to Microsoft legal. Within 24 hours, he was pulled off the project. No explicación, just reassignment. What he didn't know is that a single snippet of the video had survived the purge. A few seconds of Bill Gates speaking candidly about the unintended consequence of doing good. It was enough to raise questions among those who saw it. Just 3 employees in total. All were given NDAs, and all were reassigned or let go within a year. The video never resurfaced, but rumors began to swirl in fringe circles. Whispers of a secret confession, a Gates tape, a lost cleaner who vanished after uncovering something she shouldn't have. One blogger, obsessed with corporate whistleblowers, wrote a speculative series in 2012 called The Housekeeper Files. It gained modest traction online before being scrubbed after cease and desist. The blogger disappeared offline shortly after. But in Mexico City, a mural went up overnight in the district of Iztapalapa, a stylized painting of a woman in a maid's uniform holding a VHS tape like a torch, eyes forward, mouth closed. De acuerdo son derniz. La justicia no siempre necesita un nombre. Justice doesn't always need a name. To this day, no one has claimed credit for the mural, and no one can verify Maria's whereabouts. But every few years, a new piece of anonymous evidence leaks. Never enough to verify, always enough to stir interest. A handwritten letter referencing Javier's case appeared in a box of declassified NGO files in Madrid. A USB drive labeled Room was discovered at a free press archive in Sao Paulo. Each clue vanishes into investigative limbo. It's as if someone, somewhere, is keeping the memory alive. Quietly, deliberately, like breadcrumbs across continents. And somewhere, perhaps, Maria watches, listens, waits, because for people like her, the mission never ends. It only changes form. By 2015, whispers of Maria's story had transformed into an urban legend among those in tech security, human rights law, and investigative journalism. Conference bars buzzed with fragmented accounts and half-remembered details. A cleaner, a tape, a confession that could rock the world's trust in one of its wealthiest men. But no one had the full story, and that was by design. In Geneva, at a closed-door symposium on digital privacy hosted by an NGO with indirect ties to the UN, a slide was shown to a select group of delegates. It wasn't part of the official presentation. It flickered briefly, an image of the Iztapalapa mural, and then disappeared. The presenter, a young Brazilian activist, made no mention of it, but several in the room exchanged glances. They recognized the symbol. One of those attendees was Lucien d'Amberville, a retired French intelligence officer turned data ethics advisor. He had spent decades chasing digital ghosts and watching truth get buried beneath layers of corporate protection and geopolitical agendas. That night, over brandy in a quiet lounge, he told a young reporter from Le Monde that the Maria story reminded him of a Cold War legend, one where a single individual could alter a narrative more powerfully than a state. "Do you believe she's real?" the reporter asked. Lucien sipped his drink. "I believe someone kept a secret worth more than any payout." That kind of silence, it leaves a mark. Meanwhile, back in the U.S., the mansion overlooking Lake Washington had changed. Xanadu 2.0 had undergone several rounds of security upgrades: thermal imaging walls, autonomous drone surveillance, behavioral biometric locks. But the room? That had been dismantled, or so the official report claimed. But one evening, a maintenance contractor on site for a system recalibration noticed something odd. A wall in the east wing read slightly off on the laser grid, less dense than the blueprints indicated. He flagged it in a routine report. A week later, he was reassigned to a Microsoft campus in Ireland. He never brought it up again. What he didn't know, and what very few have pieced together, is that the room had been relocated, not destroyed. A digital twin of its contents had been created, air-gapped, isolated, stored beneath the Microsoft Arctic World Archive facility in Svalbard, Norway. It was accessible only through a biometric signature that no longer existed in active records: Maria Estrades. You see, she had left more than just a tape behind. Unbeknownst to the investigators who reviewed her employee logs, Maria had also been part of a shadow IT protocol designed to test employee access redundancies. In 2003, she was temporarily granted elevated clearance to simulate a social engineering breach, an internal experiment commissioned by Gates' own cybersecurity think tank. The project had been canceled, and Maria's credentials were supposed to be revoked. But in the chaos of a system migration in early 2004, her access remained, obscured under a mislabeled alias, MS4D4 underscore internal sim. For nearly a year, she was a ghost in the machine. And during that year, she didn't just view the room, she cataloged it, archived it, redacted names, coded file references, created a breadcrumb trail so subtle it would take a digital archaeologist a decade to even begin deciphering. Some say she created a failsafe. Others believe it was a confession of her own, coded in layers of metadata and distributed across dozens of server farms under innocent project names like OpenRain, Cascade Event, and Giftbox. By 2020, independent researchers began to stumble on inconsistencies, fragmented records that pointed toward a suppressed series of internal memos from 1998 to 1999 related to African aid distribution, the same time period referenced in the lost tape. One particular memo, retrieved via a public records request from a defunct UK subsidiary, mentioned a systemic impact anomaly following deployment of resources. The language was bureaucratic, cold, but between the lines, it screamed damage control. Still, no definitive link to the tape. No mention of Maria. Until 2023. In a declassified FOIA document dumped by a civil liberties group, a redacted U.S. State Department briefing from 2006 surfaced. Most of it was standard diplomatic noise. But buried deep on page 47 was a line item under soft threats, civilian intelligence actors. Codename, Housekeeper. Status, non-hostile. Asset classified under symbolic influence risk. No pursuit recommended. It was the first government-level confirmation that Maria, or someone like her, had been acknowledged as a variable in a global risk matrix. Not a threat in the traditional sense, but a symbol. And symbols have a strange power. Around the same time, a retired archivist at a digital rights library in Buenos Aires found something unusual in a box mislabeled as early web policy materials. It was a typewritten letter and signed, detailing the ethical implications of what it called benevolent coercion. The writer spoke of trying to do good, failing, and watching that failure become institutionalized. At the end of the letter was a line. When power corrects itself, it rarely leaves fingerprints. But I left one, just one, because someday, someone will know where to look. No one could verify the authorship, but several researchers now believe it was Maria's final message. By now, her story had become more than just an anecdote. It had become a framework. Digital ethics courses referenced the housekeeper hypothesis when discussing whistleblower asymmetry. Journalists cited her as an example of tactical non-exposure, the act of withholding the truth in a way that creates more momentum than releasing it outright. And yet, through all of this, she never surfaced. No interviews, no books, no leaks traced definitively to her. Just echoes. In 2024, a podcast titled Room, the Maria Files climbed to the top of the investigative charts. Hosted by a former NSA analyst turned journalist, the 10-part series dissected everything. The architecture of Xanadu 2.0, the tech behind analog security failures, the ethics of silence. In episode 7, a former housekeeper under anonymity told the host, there was always something strange about her. She never got angry, never flustered, like she was watching history happen, even while folding laundry. And that may have been the truth of Maria Estrada. Not a thief, not a spy, a witness, a silent sentinel in the halls of one of the most powerful homes in the world. And as long as the world remembers the story, even in fragments, her mission continues. Somewhere, a dusty server still hums with data labeled MS4D 4 underscore internal sim. Somewhere, a redacted file waits for the right person to ask the right question. And somewhere, maybe in a quiet village or bustling city, A woman watches the digital world twist and turn, knowing that sometimes the most powerful secrets are the ones that never get told, but only hinted at. And that is the real theft. Not the tape, not the files, but the narrative, taken from the powerful, given piece by piece to those who dare to question. Maria didn't just steal a secret. She stole history and rewrote it from the shadows. In 2017, a quiet presentation was given at Chatham House, London. It wasn't the main event, more of a side discussion among a small group of tech analysts, human rights activists, and international policy experts. The presenter, a former journalist turned cybersecurity consultant, spoke with the kind of conviction that made everyone listen, even though they initially thought it was just another theory. The topic, the Housekeeper files. The consultant explained how a series of seemingly unrelated events, leaks, stories, and subtle references in obscure forums, had pointed toward a woman who had become a symbol of quiet rebellion. There's a common thread, he said, in the story of Maria Estrada, someone who had access to one of the most powerful people in the world and chose to use it not for personal gain, but for something larger. He outlined the case of Maria as an example of what he called passive whistleblowing. Unlike the dramatic, high-profile leaks of figures like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning, Maria had never directly exposed anything. She had only planted seeds, left traces, breadcrumbs, across the globe. By the end of the talk, most of the audience was convinced of one thing. Maria Estrada was no longer just a former housekeeper. She had become a mythical figure in the world of information warfare, a ghost who had altered the course of history without anyone ever fully realizing it. One of the analysts in the audience, an expert in international law, leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "She may not have directly exposed the tape, but her silence. It's as if she understood the power of not speaking, of letting others fill in the gaps." His colleague nodded, her eyes wide with realization. She may have done more damage than any public leak could have. Meanwhile, far away from these intellectual debates, a more personal story continued to unfold in the streets of Mexico City. For years, Maria had been quietly advocating for her brother's case, no longer through underground channels, but through formal human rights organizations. Under the guise of different names, she had worked with activists to push for justice, slowly but surely gaining traction in the right circles. Javier Estrada, the brother who had once been labeled a criminal, was now seen by many as a victim of a larger system of corporate and governmental corruption. His case, buried deep in legal limbo, was finally being revisited. Maria's quiet campaign had made its mark. In 2007, after years of legal wrangling, Javier was released from prison. Officially, it was due to an administrative error, something that had been swept under the rug. Unofficially, however, it was clear to many that external pressure had played a role. Maria, however, never sought the spotlight. She didn't want to be known for what she had done. Her life, by all accounts, was an exercise in invisibility. She had left behind her former life, adopting a series of identities, living in various places, always under the radar. She didn't need the recognition. The justice she fought for, even in the shadows, was her only reward. By 2008, Maria had disappeared from Seattle without a trace. There were rumors, of course, rumors of her being spotted in cities across North America, perhaps even in Europe, but no one could confirm anything. She was like a shadow that vanished the moment you try to focus on it. The legacy of the room, however, lived on in more subtle ways. In corporate boardrooms and government offices, there were occasional whispers of the Gates tape. Occasionally, a file would mysteriously disappear, or a piece of incriminating evidence would vanish in a flurry of misdirected emails. It wasn't enough to bring anyone to trial, but it was enough to ensure that the truth of that moment in 1998, Bill Gates' own reflection on the unintended consequences of his philanthropic efforts, remained buried, unspoken, and yet never fully forgotten. But Maria's real legacy was not in the tape. It wasn't in the secret room or the digital breadcrumbs that still floated through the deep web. It wasn't even in the quiet victory of her brother's release. Her legacy was in the power she had harnessed, the quiet ability to shift the course of events without ever needing to make her presence known. Her mission had been one of subtle influence. By carefully crafting her actions, Maria had become a symbol of quiet justice, showing the world that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the fight for truth was the one that was never wielded at all. And so, as time passed, Maria Estrada became a ghost story, a tale of a woman who worked in the shadows to bring light to the darkest corners of power. No one knew exactly where she was, or even if she was still alive. But her impact was undeniable. In the world of digital secrecy, in the world of hidden archives and corporate malfeasance, Maria had left her mark, not through the revelation of a single truth, but through the way she had made others question everything they thought they knew. Her story was a reminder that sometimes the greatest heists don't involve stolen wealth. Sometimes they involve stolen history. And sometimes that history is rewritten quietly, one shadow at a time. By 2019, the story of Maria Estrada, though fading from public consciousness, remained an undercurrent of intrigue in certain circles. It had become more of a legend than an actual case, a whispered tale in coffee shops, during late-night meetings, and in the dimly lit corners of online forums dedicated to corporate conspiracy theories. But those who had dug deeper, those who had followed the breadcrumbs left behind, knew that the true story was still out there, hidden beneath layers of digital debris and carefully guarded files. A few investigative journalists, frustrated by the lack of progress on other stories, began to revisit the mystery of the Gates tape. They combed through court records, public filings, and old interviews, hoping for a break. They scoured social media for traces, sifting through decades-old posts and encrypted messages that might lead them closer to the elusive Maria. Most were drawn to the more glamorous elements of the story, the secrets within Bill Gates' mansion, the political repercussions, the scandal. But the deeper they looked, the more they found themselves drawn into the unsolvable puzzle that was Maria herself. In 2019, one particular journalist, Henry Salazar, took an interest in the story. He had been writing about tech and politics for over a decade, covering everything from Silicon Valley corruption to the ethical quandaries of digital privacy. But the Maria Estrada case intrigued him in a way no other story had. He couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play, something he couldn't quite pinpoint. Salazar spent months piecing together the various threads of Maria's life. Her immigration to the U.S., her years of service at the Gates Mansion, the way she had quietly influenced Javier's case, the small, cryptic references to her name in legal documents and news archives. He dug into the corporate world's deep ties to human rights organizations, trying to connect the dots between the powerful tech executives and the marginalized voices in developing countries. It became clear that Maria's story wasn't just about a whistleblower. It was about something deeper, the way power, influence, and truth collided in the most unexpected of ways. Maria was more than just a woman who had stolen a videotape. She had become a symbol of resistance, an invisible force that had quietly undermined a system of power from the inside. Salazar's investigation led him to a series of obscure documents stored in the archives of a defunct human rights organization based in the Caribbean. It was a place few people would have thought to look. Among these dusty, poorly preserved files, he found a series of reports referencing Maria Estrada and Javier's case. The documents weren't directly connected to the tape, but they offered insight into the network of people who had been working to support Javier, people who in turn had supported Maria without fully understanding her motivations. One particular document stood out, an email thread from a small NGO based in Africa detailing their efforts to track the misappropriation of funds for humanitarian aid. The thread contained several references to assets who had access to sensitive information, assets that were described as invisible agents, working under the radar. One email from a legal consultant working with the NGO mentioned that Maria had been a key player in shifting the focus of the case to the larger international context, away from the Gates Foundation and toward broader systemic corruption. The email noted how Maria had somehow managed to get the right people to pay attention without ever making herself known. Salazar couldn't believe what he was reading. It was as if Maria had been orchestrating a silent campaign all along, using the very systems designed to protect powerful interests to turn the tide in favor of those who had no voice. The deeper he delved, the more he began to understand that Maria's role in this had never been about the tape itself. It wasn't about the scandal it could cause. It wasn't even about her brother's release, though that was certainly a key moment in the story. What Maria had done was use the very structures of power to dismantle themselves from within, manipulating them in ways that could only be understood by those who had the patience to look beyond the surface. In 2020, Salazar published his findings in a long-form investigative piece titled "The Ghost in the House." The article detailed his search for the truth behind Maria Estrada, her motivations, her actions, and her legacy. It explored the ethical dimensions of her choices, framing her as a hero, not because she had stolen the tape, but because she had known exactly how to make the world see what it needed to see without exposing herself. The piece became an underground sensation, gaining traction in niche corners of the internet and academic journals, where the story resonated with those who understood the complexity of power and secrecy. The article caught the attention of a few key figures, people who had once worked with Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation. They were now retired or working in quieter roles, far from the public eye. Some reached out to Salazar privately, offering fragments of their own recollections about the mysterious Maria. One former aide admitted that she had been the ghost in the machine of the foundation for years. No one ever knew exactly who she was, he said, but we all knew there was someone pulling strings in the background. Despite the small ripple the article caused, it was quickly buried by mainstream media. The Gates Foundation and its affiliates, always quick to suppress anything that could damage their public image, quietly discredited the article and its findings. Yet the narrative, once started, could not be so easily erased. In the years following Salazar's article, the story of Maria Estrada continued to resurface in strange, often unexpected places. Independent podcasts explore the mystery. A small book on digital ethics devoted a chapter to her, framing her actions as an essential study in the power of silence in a world increasingly dominated by noise. And in 2023, a mural appeared in a prominent park in San Francisco. An abstract image of a woman with a VHS tape in her hand, eyes hidden behind dark glasses, standing tall against a backdrop of concrete and glass. The words beneath it were simple: truth in silence. No one knew if it was an homage to Maria or simply a coincidence, but it served as a reminder that her influence had never truly gone away. She had never needed to be a public figure to change the course of history. Maria Estrada had done her work in the shadows, and perhaps that was where her true power lay. And so, the legend of Maria Estrada continued to live on, not in the form of a single expose or a viral scandal, but in the quiet, enduring influence of a woman who had used secrecy as a weapon, not for personal gain, but for the greater good. Her story remained unfinished, fading into the background of history, but always there, just out of sight, waiting for someone to remember. Because sometimes, the most important truths are the ones that are never told. As the years passed, the story of Maria Estrada quietly slipped further into the shadows of history, but her influence lingered in the places where power and justice collided, in the small acts of rebellion that went unnoticed by most. Her story, now a myth woven into the fabric of digital secrecy and corporate power, was slowly being forgotten, but there were still those who remembered, who sought to understand her true impact. In 2024, a young journalist named Alicia Ramirez, intrigued by the older investigations into Maria, began her own pursuit of the elusive figure. Alicia had grown up hearing whispers of Maria's story. Her name had been dropped in hushed conversations at journalism conferences, and obscure references had appeared in niche publications she followed. What had once been an obscure legend was now a quiet obsession for her. Driven by curiosity, Alicia started to track down the pieces of Maria's story, focusing on the documents that were still scattered across the world, on the lingering echoes of her quiet revolution. Alicia first discovered a series of archived emails that referenced Maria's involvement in shifting international discussions about the ethics of philanthropy. They were buried within a set of declassified memos from a major international conference on global transparency in 2009. At first, Alicia thought they might be tangential to Maria's story, but as she dug deeper, she found patterns. The documents were filled with discussions of how someone had been quietly influencing the terms of debate, ensuring that certain issues were brought to the table while others were pushed aside. No names were mentioned directly, but it became increasingly clear that someone had been pulling strings from behind the scenes. This led Alicia to a chilling realization. Maria had been much more than a whistleblower or a force behind Javier's release. She had been part of a larger, invisible network of influencers, those who had come to understand the limitations of traditional activism and used their positions of power, however small or seemingly insignificant, to manipulate systems of power from within. Maria had not just been one woman with a tape. She had been the quiet architect of change in a world that demanded noise and spectacle. Alicia's search took her to a small legal firm in Buenos Aires that had once been involved in Javier's case. The firm had worked closely with human rights organizations that had been trying to bring international attention to Javier's imprisonment. One of the senior lawyers at the firm, now retired, had once been part of the underground effort to support Maria's silent campaign. He recalled how, in the early 2000s, several international activists had been alerted to the case, but only through indirect means. It was strange, he said. There was always a sense that someone was feeding us information, but no one ever saw her face. She was like a shadow. The lawyer was hesitant to speak at first, but eventually, he shared a series of encrypted messages he had received from Maria during the months leading up to Javier's release. These messages, sent from various untraceable email accounts, outlined strategic steps for putting pressure on the Mexican government, guiding them toward a path that would result in Javier's eventual release. He spoke of how she had used the international spotlight on corporate accountability to shine light on Javier's unjust imprisonment, all while remaining completely anonymous. Alicia's heart raced as she began piecing together the magnitude of Maria's actions. It was clear now that the network Maria had built was not only concerned with Javier's case, but was also focused on changing the broader conversation about justice, transparency, and accountability. The connections were complex and difficult to track, but they spanned across continents, weaving through both non-governmental organizations and corporate boardrooms, influencing policy and pushing for reforms. Maria had, in a sense, created an invisible web of influence, one that didn't rely on publicity or fame, but on the quiet, methodical manipulation of systems of power. By the time Alicia's investigation reached a conclusion, she had gathered enough to write a detailed expose. Her article, "The Ghost Who Changed the System," was published in late 2024. It became an immediate sensation in the underground world of investigative journalism. It was a tale of power, secrecy, and influence, exploring how one woman, working in the shadows, had managed to manipulate vast global systems with nothing more than her intellect and her understanding of how to use silence as a weapon. Alicia's piece sparked renewed interest in Maria's legacy, leading to a resurgence of curiosity about the quiet heroine who had never sought the spotlight. The article caught the attention of a new generation of activists who were grappling with the complexities of modern activism in an era dominated by social media and instant gratification. Maria's approach, slow, deliberate, and calculated, was a model they had never seen before. Her influence was a reminder that not every fight for justice had to be loud or flashy. Sometimes, the most effective actions were those that were done in silence, out of the public eye, but with a lasting impact. Meanwhile, a small community of scholars dedicated to studying the ethics of secrecy in the digital age began to explore Maria's story in greater depth. They delved into the philosophical implications of her actions, how a seemingly insignificant figure had been able to use the very systems of power meant to control others against themselves. Maria's legacy became a focal point in the study of digital ethics, information warfare, and human rights. However, the most profound impact of Alicia's article wasn't on academia or the media. It was on a young woman in a small village in Mexico who had been following the story of Maria since she was a child. Inspired by the quiet revolution Maria had sparked, this young woman started her own advocacy group focused on fighting corruption and injustice in her community. She, too, chose the path of subtlety, working quietly behind the scenes to build a network of supporters and slowly influencing change without ever revealing her identity. In the years that followed, her work grew, though her face was never known. Maria's legacy continued, not through fame or recognition, but through the ripple effect she had left behind, a blueprint for those who wish to make a difference without the need for public accolades or recognition. For some, Maria Estrada was the quiet force that reshaped their understanding of what true power could look like, not in front of cameras or on social media, but in the unseen moments where one individual could use the system against itself for the greater good. Her story, still largely untold and shrouded in mystery, was a reminder to the world that sometimes the most powerful actions are the ones done in silence. And though the world may never know the full extent of her work, the ripple effect of Maria's quiet revolution would echo for years to come, shifting the tides of justice and transparency, one unseen step at a time. In the years that followed, there were whispers, brief mentions in obscure articles, vague references in online forums, and a series of anonymous leaks that pointed to a nameless figure who had influenced major legal reforms. These small sparks of recognition barely scratched the surface of what Maria had truly done, but they were enough to stir interest in a new kind of activism, one that didn't rely on public displays of power, but rather on quiet persistence, subtlety, and access to systems that could bring about real change. Across the globe, Maria's methods were slowly adopted by a growing underground network of activists, hackers, and journalists who understood that true change didn't always come with headlines. They followed her example of anonymity, working behind the scenes, gathering intelligence, and revealing just enough to force the powerful to change without ever claiming credit. These individuals never spoke about Maria directly, but they knew that their work was inspired by her, and they kept her methods alive in the shadows. In cities far from Seattle, human rights organizations and small NGOs began to use the quiet tools Maria had once wielded, gathering evidence of corporate corruption, leaking documents to the press in small, controlled bursts, all while remaining faceless and untraceable. The activists studied Maria's tactics, recognizing that it wasn't always about a single dramatic moment. It was about creating a slow, irreversible shift by working within systems and exposing their flaws from the inside out. There were also those who tried to dig deeper into Maria's past. Some investigative journalists attempted to uncover the true story behind the Gates housekeeper, the woman who had stolen a moment of truth and used it to challenge the global system. Yet, every attempt to reveal her went unanswered. Maria had vanished without a trace, and those who came close to uncovering her identity were met with dead ends, as if the very records of her existence had been erased. But even without a name, her actions continued to resonate. Lawyers working on political cases refer to her, though they never cited her directly, as an example of how power could be manipulated without ever taking the spotlight. Whistleblower networks, inspired by the unknown figure who had worked behind the scenes to free her brother and expose a corrupt system, thrived in the shadows, knowing that their cause was noble, even if no one ever knew their names. One day, a journalist, unaware of Maria's past, stumbled upon an old article about a human rights case in Mexico, a case that had been quietly fueled by leaks, confidential evidence, and anonymous tips. The journalist followed the trail, piecing together the quiet, disconnected acts that had contributed to the case's success. And though the journalist never put the pieces together to reveal Maria's role, there was a quiet recognition of the methods she had pioneered. And so, the cycle continued. Small victories, anonymous leaks, quiet whispers of justice in a world that often demanded spectacle. Maria's influence, never overt but always present, became a subtle but critical force in shaping the way activism was viewed in the digital age. No one knew where Maria had gone after her time at the Gates residence, but her legacy was undeniable. Whether she remained in the shadows, continuing her work under a new identity, or whether she had simply vanished entirely, she had left behind a blueprint for those who believed in quiet, systemic change. Her story remained untold, but in a way, it didn't need to be, because the work itself spoke louder than any name ever could. The world may not have known her as the woman who took down corrupt systems from within, but those who understood the value of patience, silence, and subtlety had learned her lesson well. And so, the world shifted, one hidden act of resistance at a time. The years passed, but the ripple effects of Maria's actions never truly faded. Her influence had planted the seeds of a different kind of activism, one that took root in quiet corners of society where most people would never look. In time, this kind of invisible revolution became not only a model for activists, but also a critical tool for whistleblowers within large organizations, governments, and corporations. Around the world, in bustling cities and remote villages, a new generation began to use the tools Maria had unwittingly passed on. Encrypted communications, hidden messages, anonymous leaks, and the strategic release of information. Many of them were inspired by the same values that Maria had upheld: justice, truth, and the pursuit of transparency, all without seeking personal glory. One day, a woman in Paris, who had long been part of an activist collective, discovered a set of encrypted files on a long-forgotten server. She didn't know at the time, but the files contained a series of messages, coordinates, and pieces of evidence that could potentially expose a major international scandal, one that spanned across several nations. The woman, feeling a strange sense of familiarity in the way the information was structured, began to piece together the fragments. She realized that this was no ordinary set of files, but something carefully orchestrated, something that bore the same careful touch she had once heard described in passing stories about an anonymous housekeeper. The more she investigated, the more she realized that this wasn't the first time such actions had quietly shifted the tides. The files she found mirrored the tactics Maria had once used: silent, slow-burning revelations that left enough room for those in power to act, but without the threat of immediate exposure. The woman couldn't help but wonder if the legendary figure that had once changed everything, whose identity remained obscured by time, was somehow linked to this. But no answers came, only more questions. She began following the same path as those before her: small, anonymous releases of information, often under the cover of darkness. She knew that people like her could do more from the shadows than anyone in the spotlight ever could. She adopted a new name and, in many ways, erased her old life entirely. Her goal wasn't fame, but progress. Just like Maria, as more people found themselves inspired by these subtle methods, the global conversation began to shift. The public grew increasingly aware of the forces at play behind the scenes, but there were few who ever saw the full picture. Governments and corporations, once convinced they could maintain control through sheer power, now faced challenges they couldn't easily erase. Each new leak, each news story coming from unknown sources, chipped away at their authority. They had learned to fear the quiet more than the loud protests. Meanwhile, Maria's influence stretched beyond the activist world. Within the corridors of power, in boardrooms and law offices, people began to question what they knew and how they knew it. Some in positions of influence quietly acknowledged the existence of those like Maria, whose work had never been publicized but whose impact had been undeniable. They saw how Maria had used the systems meant to control people to instead bring about real change. Her actions had planted a seed in the minds of others who now used their knowledge, their access, and their discretion in the pursuit of fairness. Though many were unaware of the woman behind the revolution, the effects were clear. A new kind of accountability began to take root. Corporations and governments, once insulated from criticism by their wealth and power, found themselves under increasing scrutiny, not from the loud, chaotic movements, but from the quiet, methodical work of individuals who understood that real change didn't always have to be seen to be effective. It was the long-term, quiet pressure that moved the needle. The story of the Gates housekeeper, too, faded further into history, its details becoming more obscure with every passing year. No one ever uncovered her true identity, and no one ever fully understood the scale of her impact. But the work she had done continued to inspire those who valued justice over recognition. They knew that the quiet revolutions were often the most powerful, and they carried on her legacy without fanfare. In a small, unremarkable corner of the world, a mural appeared on the side of a crumbling building, the image of a woman in a maid's uniform holding a VHS tape, her face obscured by shadows. Beneath it, in simple lettering, were the words, La lucha no siempre es ruidosa, pero es profunda. The struggle is not always loud, but it is deep. It was a tribute to an unknown woman whose quiet revolution had rippled through history, shaping the world without anyone ever knowing her name. And so, Maria's legacy endured, not through headlines or fame, but through the subtle, lasting impact of her actions. A testament to the fact that sometimes the most powerful movements aren't those that demand attention, but those that quietly make their mark one step at a time. As time went on, Maria's actions began to fade from immediate memory, but the principles she had embodied, justice, subtlety, and the power of quiet revolution, continued to reverberate. The world, it seemed, was evolving, and her legacy remained woven into the fabric of the movements that came after her. In places where whispers of her deeds once lingered, a new understanding began to take root. True power was not always loud, and change could come from the most unexpected of places. Her name remained unknown to the public, and perhaps that was the way she had always intended it. In a world obsessed with fame and recognition, Maria had chosen the path of silence, leaving behind no public trace except the whispers of those who had been touched by her work. But she had known, as few others did, that the real impact came not from the world watching you, but from the world unknowingly feeling the weight of your actions. In the end, Maria had become a symbol of something more profound than any individual. She had become a quiet catalyst for change. In the small, tucked-away corners of the world, her influence lingered like a soft shadow. And though no one knew her story in full, no one could deny that she had been a part of something much larger than herself. She had struck at the heart of corruption with nothing but a few stolen moments of truth, and those moments had set in motion a ripple effect that changed the lives of countless people. A decade passed, and the world continued to turn, as it always does. The powerful, those who had once been so certain that they could maintain their control, found themselves increasingly unable to stop the slow-moving tide of transparency and accountability. The methods Maria had pioneered, small leaks of information, Anonymous tips, subtle shifts in perception, have become a norm for those who fought against corruption in the shadows. They didn't crave the spotlight. They understood that true justice was often a slow, quiet process, requiring patience and the willingness to wait for the right moment. In a quiet town, far removed from the halls of power, a former journalist named Raul Perez sat alone in his modest apartment, his gaze fixed on a stack of old, yellowing documents. He had been a part of the underground movement for years, and though he had never met Maria personally, her influence had shaped everything he did. The evidence he had discovered was damning. Details of a corrupt international deal that could bring down powerful figures in several countries. It was the kind of story that would make headlines, the kind that could change everything. But Roll had learned the lesson that Maria had taught him all those years ago. He knew that just because something could be revealed didn't mean it should be, at least not all at once. Instead, he followed Maria's example. He released pieces of the story slowly, carefully, each small leak building pressure until, eventually, the truth could no longer be hidden. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't about glory. It was about justice. He worked in the shadows, just as she had, and over time, the story he had uncovered began to unfold. The information spread in quiet ways, leaked to trusted journalists, anonymous emails sent to the right people, the story unfolding like a slow-burning fuse. It wasn't long before the powerful figures involved in the deal found themselves under intense scrutiny. Investigations were launched and pressure mounted. One day, Raoul received an encrypted message from an old contact in the NGO world. The message was brief, but it contained something that sent a shiver down his spine. A reference to the mysterious housekeeper who had once made a difference in a way no one else had. The message simply read, "She's still out there. Her legacy lives on in the work we do." Raoul sat back, staring at the screen. He didn't know who had sent the message or what it meant, but he understood. Maria's influence, though invisible, was far-reaching. She had created a quiet revolution, a movement of small acts that, when combined, had the power to topple empires. And even though she had vanished from the world's view, her work had lived on, passed down through those who had taken her lessons to heart. It was clear to Raoul that Maria's revolution hadn't been just about one act of resistance, one moment of justice. It was about creating a movement that lived on in the hearts of those who believed in the power of small, quiet actions. It was a revolution that didn't need to be seen to be effective. It was a revolution of principles, a revolution of the mind, a revolution that continued long after its instigator had disappeared into history. But Maria's legacy wasn't just about anonymous leaks or quiet movements. It was also about the change she had brought to the lives of real people. Javier, Maria's brother, had gone on to become a symbol of the fight for political prisoners, and his release had sparked a wave of reforms across Latin America. His case, once thought to be a forgotten tragedy, had become a rallying point for those seeking justice for the oppressed. And though Maria had never sought recognition, her quiet efforts had freed a man who, in turn, had freed many others. The mural that had appeared in Mexico City, depicting the woman in the maid's uniform holding the VHS tape, continued to stand as a testament to the power of silent resistance. It had been repainted several times, its colors brightening with each new layer, each new act of defiance. The words beneath it, "La lucha no siempre es ruidosa, pero es profunda," remained as relevant as ever. The struggle is not always loud, but it is deep. And in some forgotten corner of the world, Maria remained just a whisper. Her actions had shaped the course of history, but her name would never be spoken in the same breath as the great figures of the past. She didn't need to be remembered by the masses. The work, the change she had set in motion, was enough. Her story would never be fully told, but it didn't need to be, because the revolution she had sparked was alive, and it was still unfolding quietly, steadily, just as she had always intended. The world didn't need to know her name. The world had already been changed by her actions.